They threw Big Shaq out of the boardroom, laughing, thinking they had won. What they didn't know? He owned the company they thought they controlled. The same men who humiliated him were about to beg for mercy. Because Shaquille O'Neal wasn't just taking his seat back, he was taking everything. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Shaquille O'Neal had been in plenty of high-pressure situations in his life. Game 7s, championship runs, billion-dollar endorsement negotiations. But stepping into the boardroom of Titan Enterprises felt different. The air was thick with an unspoken tension, a silent resistance that had nothing to do with business strategies or quarterly reports. He walked in with the quiet confidence of a man who had nothing to prove, yet everything to claim. Dressed in a tailored navy blue suit, he towered over the sleek modern conference table, his presence alone commanding attention. Yet, instead of respect, what he received was something far more familiar, something he had encountered his entire life in rooms like these. Doubt. Titan Enterprises was no ordinary company. It was a powerhouse in the tech and real estate sectors, its boardroom filled with old money executives who had spent decades building their fortunes on inherited wealth and inside deals. Shaq, on the other hand, had built his empire through hard work, smart investments, and an instinct that had served him well both on and off the court. But to them, he was still just an athlete. A few board members exchanged murmurs as he took his seat. Their glances were quick but revealing, some indifferent, some mildly amused, others openly skeptical. At the head of the table sat Richard Langston, the company's CEO. An aging but sharp businessman with slicked-back silver hair, Richard had the air of a man who had never once questioned his own authority. His fingers drummed against the polished oak table as he leaned back in his chair, eyes assessing Shaq like an uninvited guest at an exclusive club. "Glad you could make it, Shaquille," Richard finally said, his tone dripping with the forced politeness of someone who had no real interest in being welcoming. Shaq simply nodded, his expression unreadable. He had faced worse. Let them doubt him. To his left sat Catherine Sterling, one of the company's most influential board members. A woman in her mid-40s with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, she had built a reputation for playing both sides of any corporate war. Today, she offered Shaq a tight-lipped smile, though her gaze flickered toward Richard for just a second too long, a silent allegiance. On the far end of the table, Daniel Carter, Shaq's longtime advisor and supposed ally, avoided his gaze altogether. That was the first real warning sign. Daniel had been with him for years, navigating investment deals, advising on financial strategies. If Daniel was choosing silence now, it meant something was deeply wrong. The meeting began with the usual formalities: financial projections, market trends, upcoming ventures. Shaq listened intently, his mind processing every number, every detail. But it wasn't long before he realized the real meeting was happening beneath the surface. Every time he spoke, his words were interrupted or downplayed. Every time he proposed an idea, it was met with dismissal or thinly veiled condescension. When he mentioned expanding into minority-owned real estate projects, a move that aligned with Titan's supposed corporate vision, Richard let out a quiet chuckle. "That's an interesting perspective, Shaquille," he said, exchanging a knowing glance with Catherine. "But we prefer to stick to proven strategies." The comment was subtle, almost dismissible, but Shaq knew exactly what it meant. "We don't take financial advice from you." The condescension was almost impressive in its restraint. There were no outright insults, no overt hostility, just a series of carefully placed slights, expertly woven into corporate jargon. But Shaq didn't react. Not yet. He had learned a long time ago that the most powerful man in the room wasn't always the loudest. The meeting dragged on, and the tension grew heavier. Richard dominated the conversation, steering it away from anything Shaq suggested, subtly reinforcing the idea that he didn't belong here. And then, it happened. Richard cleared his throat, adopting the tone of a man about to make a reasonable yet firm decision. "Before we move forward, there's one more matter we need to address." The room fell silent. Shaq sat up, sensing the shift. "Due to recent internal restructuring," Richard continued, "we've decided to limit board access to only those with active operational roles in the company. As such, We will be holding a vote on whether Mr. O'Neill's participation in these meetings should continue." The words landed like a quiet bomb. Shaq looked around the room. Not a single surprised face. This had been planned, discussed in whispered conversations behind closed doors, settled before he even stepped into the building. And just like that, it was clear. They wanted him out. He had been blindsided before, in business, in life. But this wasn't just a move against him. This was a calculated humiliation. The so-called vote was a mere formality. One by one, the hands around the table went up in agreement. Daniel hesitated, but only for a moment, before raising his hand too. That was the final confirmation. Shaq exhaled slowly, letting the betrayal settle. And then, with a cold efficiency that made it clear this was never up for debate, Richard turned to the security officer stationed by the door and gave a simple nod. "Please escort Mr. O'Neill out." Silence. The room held its collective breath as Shaq, a man who had once been cheered by millions, was now being dismissed like an outsider in a space he had helped build. The security guard hesitated. Even he knew this was wrong. Shaq could feel the weight of the moment, the smug satisfaction from Richard, the relief from those too afraid to speak up, the quiet discomfort from the few who knew this was unjust but lacked the courage to defy the room. He could have argued. He could have called them out, demanded explanations. But he didn't. Instead, he stood up, slowly, deliberately. Without a word, he adjusted his suit, gave one last unreadable look around the table, and turned toward the door. As he walked out, he caught Daniel's eye one last time. Daniel looked away. And just like that, Shaquille O'Neal, the largest silent investor in Titan Enterprises, the man who had been building something far greater than they realized, was gone. For now. Shaq had been in enough board meetings to know that Titan Enterprises wasn't run like a fair game, but this was different. This wasn't just a conversation about numbers and projections. This was an ambush, a slow, calculated dismantling of his credibility. Richard Langston leaned back in his chair, fingers tapping rhythmically against the polished surface of the table. His expression was unreadable, but the slight smirk playing at the corner of his mouth spoke volumes. Across the room, Catherine Sterling tilted her head slightly, the way a predator watches its prey just before it pounces. Shaq cleared his throat and sat forward, resting his hands on the table. "I'd like to circle back to the expansion project we discussed last quarter. The numbers don't lie. Diversifying into minority-owned real estate is not only the right move, but it's also profitable. We have the market research. The demand is there." A brief pause. Then, like clockwork, the interruptions began. "Yes, well, Shaquille," Richard said, exhaling as if he was humoring a child. "While that's an interesting idea, we need to focus on sustainable growth. We can't afford to take unnecessary risks." Shaq kept his expression neutral, but inside something tightened. "I wouldn't call a multi-billion-dollar market unnecessary. If anything, staying stagnant is the real risk." Catherine let out a soft chuckle, leaning forward as if she were on Shaq's side. "You bring a fresh perspective, Shaq, and I admire that," she said, her voice dripping with insincerity. "But sometimes experience outweighs enthusiasm. We've been in this industry a long time. Trust us when we say we know what works." Shaq didn't flinch. He had heard this kind of dismissal before, wrapped in politeness, layered with just enough patronization to make it sound reasonable. A few seats away, one of the younger board members, Harrison Wells, adjusted his tie, clearly uncomfortable. He glanced at Shaq, then at Richard, and then quickly looked down at the table. He wasn't about to step in. None of them were. "With all due respect," Shaq said, keeping his tone measured, "I've built businesses from the ground up. I know how to spot an opportunity when I see one." Richard sighed dramatically, rubbing his temples as if Shaq was exhausting him. "Yes, and we respect your, entrepreneurial spirit, but Titan operates differently. We have a structure, a system in place that—" Shaq didn't let him finish. "A system that's outdated and excluding entire demographics. This isn't just a business decision, it's a shift that will—" "Shaquille," Richard interrupted again, his voice sharpening. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves." Catherine sighed and gave a soft, practiced smile. I think what Richard is trying to say is, Titan Enterprises has a certain approach to things, one that has kept us at the top. We have to be strategic. You understand, don't you? Shaq let the silence stretch for a beat too long, his gaze steady. I understand perfectly. The tension in the room thickened, the unspoken words louder than anything being said aloud. He didn't belong here. Not really. Not in their eyes. Daniel Carter, Shaq's longtime advisor, sat across the table, eyes fixed on the glossy report in front of him. He hadn't spoken once, not in Shaq's defense, not even to ease the tension. Something in Shaq's stomach sank. Richard adjusted his cufflinks and exhaled, his smile forced and tight. I think we've spent enough time on this. We should move on to more pressing matters. Shaq could feel the shift in the room. They weren't just dismissing his idea. They were dismissing him. He had been patient. He had been professional. But patience had its limits. He leaned forward, voice calm but firm. I'm not just here as a guest speaker, Richard. I'm a major investor. I deserve a seat at this table just like anyone else in this room. The room fell silent. Richard's smirk never faltered. If anything, it grew. Actually, Richard said slowly, exchanging a glance with Catherine. That brings us to our next topic. Shaq felt it before it happened. This company has been undergoing some internal restructuring, Richard continued smoothly. And after careful consideration, the board has agreed that only those with active operational roles in Titan Enterprises should participate in these discussions. Effective immediately, we'll be holding a vote on whether or not Mr. O'Neill's continued presence in these meetings is necessary. There it was. A boardroom coup. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Shaq looked around the room, searching for any sign of resistance. Any sign that someone, anyone, was going to push back. No one spoke. One by one, hands went up. Richard. Catherine. The executives who had barely acknowledged Shaq all meeting. Even the ones who had nodded along to his ideas earlier. Then, slowly, Daniel Carter raised his hand too. Shaq felt the betrayal hit like a gut punch, but he didn't let it show. He sat there unmoving as the final vote was counted. Richard turned back to him, faux sympathy etched on his face. I'm afraid the decision is final. He didn't even have the decency to pretend to be apologetic. Shaq could feel the satisfaction radiating from the board members, the smug glances exchanged, the silent victory in their eyes. Then, Richard made a subtle motion, and Shaq heard the sound of footsteps behind him. Security. A uniformed officer stepped forward, hesitant, as if even he knew this was wrong. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. For the first time in a long time, Shaq felt something dangerously close to humiliation. They had done this deliberately, in front of everyone, stripping him of any power he thought he had in a single, calculated move. He could hear muffled chuckles from the far end of the table. Someone whispered something under their breath, and another executive stifled a smirk. But Shaq didn't move, not yet. Instead, he let the moment settle. Let them revel in their small, short-lived victory. Then, without a word, he stood. The room went still. Shaq adjusted his suit jacket, his movements slow and deliberate. He took his time, letting the weight of his presence settle one last time. He met Daniel's eyes, searching for something, an apology, regret, anything. Nothing. Finally, he turned his gaze to Richard. The older man met his stare, but there was a flicker of something there now. Unease. Because Shaq wasn't angry. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't pleading. He was calm. And that was far more dangerous. Without another word, Shaq turned and walked out of the boardroom. But what the executives didn't know, what they failed to realize, was that this wasn't over. Not even close. Shaq stepped out of the towering glass doors of Titan Enterprises, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the city. The fresh air should have been a relief, a break from the suffocating atmosphere inside that boardroom. But instead, it felt heavy, like the weight of a betrayal he hadn't fully processed yet. For years, he had told himself that money and power didn't change people, they only revealed who they truly were. He had seen it happen in sports, in friendships, in business. But somehow this one cut deeper. Maybe it was because he had trusted Daniel. Maybe it was because he had earned his place at that table, only to be cast out like he was never supposed to be there in the first place. As he walked toward his car, his phone buzzed relentlessly in his pocket. He ignored it at first, too caught up in his own thoughts, but by the time he reached the driver's side, the notifications had tripled. Something was happening. He pulled out his phone and saw his name plastered across every major news outlet. Shaq forced out of Titan Enterprises meeting. Ex-athlete overstepping his place. O'Neal humiliated in corporate showdown. Sports star tries and fails to play businessman. The Shaq delusion. When celebrities think they're executives. His jaw clenched as he scrolled through the headlines, each one more twisted than the last. They weren't just reporting the story, they were spinning it. He opened social media, and it was even worse. The internet had turned the incident into a spectacle, a public free-for-all. Some mocked him. What did he expect? Business isn't for everyone. Stick to basketball, big guy. This is what happens when athletes think they're more than just entertainers. Some defended him. Y'all do realize Shaq is worth more than half the people in that room, right? They kicked him out because they were scared. They just told the biggest investor in the company to leave? That's not business. That's some racist old boys club BS. But no matter what side people were on, one thing was clear. The story had exploded. The media wasn't just reporting what happened, they were controlling the narrative. Framing him as an outsider, a man stepping into a world that didn't belong to him. Shaq exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. This wasn't the first time people had underestimated him, and it sure as hell wouldn't be the last. But before he could process his next move, his phone rang. He looked down and saw the name flash across the screen. Lucille O'Neal. He closed his eyes for a brief moment before answering. "Hey, Ma." There was silence on the other end for a second. Then, in a voice filled with love, strength, and just the right amount of fire, she said, "They don't know who they just embarrassed, but they're about to find out." Shaq felt the tension in his chest loosen slightly. He could always count on his mother to remind him exactly who he was. "You saw it?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Lucille scoffed. "Saw it? Baby? The whole damn country saw it. And let me tell you something. This ain't over." Shaq leaned against the car, staring out at the city skyline. "Feels like they won this round." "Only if you let them," she said, her voice steady. "You let them paint you as a fool, that's what they'll remember. But you turn this into a lesson, a comeback, that's what stays in history." Shaq smirked slightly. His mother had always been good at reminding him of the bigger picture. "I already know you got something cooking," Lucille continued. "I can hear it in your voice. So whatever you're planning, do it big. Show them exactly what happens when they count you out." Shaq glanced back up at the Titan Enterprises building, its glass exterior gleaming like a fortress. He had spent years working to get a seat at that table, and now he was going to flip the damn table over. "Love you, Ma," he said, pushing himself off the car. "Love you more, baby," she replied. "Now go remind these people who you are." Shaq hung up, exhaling slowly. The game had just changed. Meanwhile, on the top floor of the Titan headquarters, Richard Langston poured himself a glass of whiskey, a smug smile curling on his lips. "You see how fast the media flipped that story?" he mused, taking a slow sip. "It's almost too easy." Catherine Sterling sat across from him, her own glass untouched. Unlike Richard, she wasn't celebrating, she was calculating. "You think he's just going to walk away?" she asked, arching an eyebrow. Richard chuckled. "Oh, come on, Catherine. What's he going to do? Cry on a podcast? This is our world. He's out of his league." Catherine wasn't so sure. She had spent years maneuvering through corporate warfare, and if there was one thing she had learned, it was this. People like Shaquille O'Neal don't just disappear. Still, it didn't matter. As far as she was concerned, Shaq was just a distraction, a loose end they had cut before moving on to the real business. She reached into her folder and pulled out a confidential document, sliding it across the table. "Now that he's out of the picture, we can finalize the London deal," she said. Richard took the papers, scanning them with interest. And no one suspects anything? Catherine shook her head. Why would they? Everyone's too busy talking about Shaq. No one's looking at what we're really doing. Richard grinned. That was the beauty of it. The London deal was something that had been brewing behind closed doors for months. An offshore investment disguised as an expansion project. If anyone actually dug into it, they'd see it for what it really was. A massive corporate fraud that could tank Titan Enterprises in a matter of years. But by the time the damage was done, Richard and Catherine would have already cashed out and walked away. We play this right, Richard said, swirling his whiskey. And in 5 years, Titan won't even be our problem anymore. Catherine smirked, leaning back in her chair. Exactly. For them, Shaquille O'Neal was already history. But what neither of them realized, what no one in that boardroom had understood, was that history was about to be rewritten. And Shaq? Shaq was about to take back everything they thought they had stolen. The weight of the past 24 hours pressed against his chest, but his expression remained unreadable. He had been humiliated, mocked, and cast out of a boardroom where he rightfully belonged. The headlines painted him as an arrogant ex-athlete trying to play in a league too big for him. But Shaq knew something they didn't. This wasn't over. A sharp knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Without waiting for an invitation, Veronica Hayes stepped inside. Dressed in a crisp black blazer and pencil skirt, she moved with a confidence that was both effortless and intimidating. A powerhouse attorney with a reputation for being ruthless in the courtroom and lethal in corporate negotiations, Veronica had been handling Shaq's business affairs for years. She dropped a thick folder onto his desk. We need to talk. Shaq leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. I'm listening. Veronica sighed, flipping open the folder. I spent the night digging through Titan's financial records, shareholder agreements, and your personal investments tied to the company. She tapped a highlighted document. And let me tell you something, Shaq. Those smug bastards just made the biggest mistake of their lives. Shaq raised an eyebrow. How so? Veronica met his gaze, her expression sharp as steel. Because you own more than all of them combined. The words hung in the air like a bomb that had just been detonated. Shaq didn't react at first. He just stared at her, processing. You own 51% of Titan Enterprises, Veronica continued. You didn't just buy into the company, you bought the company. Over the years, through silent acquisitions, stock purchases, and strategic investments, you've gradually accumulated majority control. You're not just an investor, Shaq. You are Titan's largest shareholder. A slow realization settled over him. The board hadn't just ejected him from a meeting, they had ejected the man who owned their entire empire. Shaq exhaled, shaking his head with a small smirk. So, let me get this straight. They threw me out of my own company? Precisely, Veronica said, closing the folder with a sharp snap. And they have no idea. Shaq's mind worked quickly. He had the power to walk back into that boardroom right now and turn their world upside down. He could fire Richard Langston on the spot, dissolve Catherine Sterling's influence, and expose every corrupt backdoor deal they had been running. But he didn't want to just win. He wanted to watch them drown in their own arrogance first. Shaq leaned forward, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. Let them think they won. Veronica narrowed her eyes. You sure about that? Shaq nodded. If we go in swinging now, they'll scramble to cover their tracks. But if we let them feel comfortable, let them celebrate their little victory. He paused, his smirk growing. That's when they'll make their biggest mistakes. Veronica tapped her nails against the desk, considering. You're playing the long game. Exactly. Shaq stood, his massive frame towering over the room. Let them have their moment. But when I come back, I'm not just taking my seat at the table. His eyes darkened with quiet determination. I'm taking the whole damn table. Veronica smiled, shaking her head. Remind me never to get on your bad side. Shaq chuckled. Smart woman. Richard Langston walked into his private lounge on the top floor of the Titan headquarters, a glass of bourbon already in hand. The air smelled of expensive cigars and freshly polished mahogany, the kind of environment built for men who believed they were untouchable. Catherine Sterling was already waiting for him, flipping through a report with an air of boredom. Any word on O'Neal? She asked without looking up. Richard smirked, sinking into a leather chair. He's gone quiet. Catherine raised an eyebrow. That doesn't bother you? Richard waved a dismissive hand. It means he's defeated. His ego took a hit, and now he's licking his wounds. He'll probably go on some PR tour to save face, maybe buy another fast food franchise and pretend he's a businessman again. Catherine didn't look convinced. I don't know, she murmured, setting the report down. He's not the type to just walk away. Something doesn't sit right with me. Richard chuckled, taking a slow sip of his bourbon. Relax, Catherine. We buried him in the media, turned him into a joke. He's out. We won. Catherine exhaled through her nose, but she didn't press further. She had a bad feeling about this. And soon enough, they'd realize just how badly they had underestimated Shaquille O'Neal. Shaq stood at the window of his